When we hear dialogue and debate, you've heard the Hoodie comments that, hey, the Hoodie contributed to half of the tragedy that night. In fact, there was a comment from an officer now suspended in New Orleans who say, live like a thug, die like a thug. What's your reaction? Are these just two people spouting off, or are they emblematic of a perception issue that's going on in this country?
My reaction is almost every ethnic group in this country knows what it is about them that is perceived to offend other people. It's the subject of stereotypical jokes, and it is and should be disqualified from any determination of guilt or innocence prior to an investigation. So there are, in New York City, hundreds of thousands of people stopped. 95% of them aren't doing anything wrong, and 99.5% of them aren't carrying a weapon. So in those particular situations, you've got to conclude that if someone's wearing a hoodie these days, they're probably somebody that would have had an afro 30 years ago, and they probably would have had slick back hair 40 years ago, and they might have worn dashikis 40 years ago. All it tells you is that they're part of a culture, and it's not necessarily a black culture. Asians, Hispanics, whites, you see them. It's kind of the kind of hip-hop culture of the day. People wear hoodies. Tomorrow they'll be wearing something else, and that will be the profiling subject. So, you know, what's interesting is that there are other groups, Italians, who feel that they get stereotyped, and that's why they don't like these programs that further the stereotyping, like The Sopranos and Jersey Shore. And certainly the Irish always get blamed for all the drinking on St. Patrick's Day. And young African-American males get blamed for all the crime. And it isn't that they don't play a significant part in the numbers of people who get arrested and convicted for committing crimes. But at the same time, an individual walking down the street who's not bothering anyone cannot and should not be immediately assessed, as the 911 tape shows George Zimmerman did. As
that segues us to stop and frisk in New York. And as governor, you made sure that the names of everybody that were stopped and not charged with anything were deleted or not kept on the records. You're not sitting in Albany right now. Your perspective of stop and frisk, does it do more harm than good in terms of how communities look at the police and that the net benefit versus the net cost?
Probably does more harm than good. But there would be some ways to clean it up. Someone suggested that police officers carry a card. And when they stop and frisk someone, and if they found not to do anything wrong, they'd say to the individual, by the way, if there's anything that you think was improper about the search, here's a card. You can contact the Civilian Complaint Review Board. Now, it's not that all that many people would even use the card. Some people take the card and throw it away. Some people refuse to take the card. But we just want to keep good police-community relations alive. And unfortunately, too many people in the neighborhood don't understand what the police are trying to accomplish. And too many police officers, many of them who don't live in the same neighborhoods as the individuals that they protect. And that's a serious problem. And I've got to tell you, we started a situation at the 28th and 30th precincts in the New York City Police Department. Actually, it was all over. But at the time I was a state senator, we would go in and talk to the new officers. And I could tell the new officers something that maybe the other elected officials couldn't. That I didn't grow up in Harlem. I grew up in Long Island. I grew up in Hempstead. When I first moved into Harlem, I was so afraid of all the stereotypical conduct that I had heard that, you know, if I heard a loud noise, I wouldn't come out of my apartment for a while. But as time went on, I started to find the culture of that particular neighborhood. People in Harlem are probably the friendliest people you'll ever meet. They talk to you while you're walking down the street, you know. Nice suit, you know, like I grew up in Long Island. We never said a word. Even the people we knew, we passed them in the street. It's just a different culture. No one's doing anything right or wrong. And, but the police officers don't know the culture because they don't live there. So I think that the stop and frisk needs to be more defined. You just don't stop everybody who has a hoodie on.
As an elected official, President Obama said, it's probably something you could relate to. He said, hey, you know, in this case, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon Martin. There was immediate reaction even by some of the Republican presidential hopefuls saying that he was pouring gas on the fire, if you will, of a very sensitive situation. Where, and you were governor, and there was controversial shootings at the time, while you were governor. Where does the line start and stop in terms of, you got the bully pulpit. How can you use it, and how should you use it in these situations?
I think it was used very properly by the president. I've been critic of him as to how he's handling the economy and how he's handling foreign policy. But I got to say on this one, when there is a tragedy and you're trying to pull the country together, you're not just trying to pull the people together who aren't involved. You're trying to go to the source of the pain. The source of the pain when we lose people overseas are military families. You're speaking to America, but you're specifically speaking to military families. When we have a disaster, you're talking to people, let's say it's a hurricane. You're not just talking to the country about the terrible damage and the number of deaths that may have occurred. You're talking to people who live in the path of hurricanes. So what President Obama did was he went out of his way to relate to the people who feel that there is no voice, to the parents who feel that their children who've escaped poverty, who've escaped violence, who've escaped getting other teenagers pregnant, or alcoholism, or drug abuse, and their child gets shot down, not even by the police, but by another civilian who thinks he's Rambo. What you're saying to that family is, you know something? If I had a son, they might have stopped him too. Well, I just said earlier in this program, I have a son. He was out that night. Could have been him. I felt very touched by the remarks. Before Speaker Gingrich demands equity from the president, I would suggest that he come to the table with clean hands. When you call a president a food stamp president and then say you're going to the NAACP to ask them why they would support a black candidate who let the unemployment rate go up, I don't think you should comment on this subject at all.
Last question on Trayvon Martin.
Do you think I answered this question?
I think you did. I get the sense, and certainly the defense for Mr. Zimmerman is doing what most attorneys do, in that they're casting doubt on the situation. But in the process, you're starting to hear some sullying of the name of Trayvon Martin, suspension apparently he got in school for some residue of marijuana, et cetera, and now you're hearing different accounts that night. I get the sense that people should tread carefully here, because the undercurrent of anger and frustration, if Zimmerman never spends a day in jail, and people don't think that the system was set up to give Martin's family a shot at justice, there's going to be a lot of angry people in this country. Do you feel that same kind of anger, that people ought to be real careful how we handle the next few months here?
Well, I'd like to try to ease some of the passion and the tension.
But it's out there, isn't it?
Down the line, Zimmerman is going to spend some time in jail because he obstructed an investigation. Number one, he did that. Even he admits that he did that, and he's on the 911 tape telling the policeman he hears him. Okay, I won't go over there, but he does go over there. So he's going to spend some time in jail for something. You can write that down. However, both Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin are in the same position. It's a highly publicized national case. Anything either one of them ever did in the past is going to get drawn into this case. And both individuals who are human beings and have probably made mistakes in their life. Zimmerman made a ton of them that night. Are the mistakes that they made in the past are not necessarily in any way related to what happened that evening. If Trayvon Martin had a criminal record and he was walking down the street not bothering anyone and was not a fugitive, then it's no more justifiable than it is now. And this was the beauty of Dr. Martin Luther King. He would only use subjects of an investigation who was squeaky clean. There were a number of people who didn't sit in the back of the bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955. The first victim that Dr. King went to see, he couldn't defend her because she was an unwed mother. In 2012, that would mean nothing now. In 1955, that would have been the whole conversation, that she's an unwed mother. The second victim that Dr. King went to see was also a woman who wouldn't sit in the back of the bus. He couldn't help her because she assaulted the police when they were taking her off the bus. So we would wish that the victims are totally clean, and Rosa Parks was a community person involved in her local NAACP. No one ever had anything to say about Rosa Parks. But this conversation is not about who is the purest among us. This conversation is about correct procedures in dealing with other human beings. And obviously, watch patrols have set parameters for their involvement, all of which George Zimmerman violated. So the kid was 17. I think the family and the advocates were overly defensive about the fact that there was a plastic bag that had marijuana residue in his knapsack, and he got a 5-day in-house suspension. He has no arrest record, no criminal record, and when whoever he was and however he feels, he was walking down the street and made a phone call to a friend saying, "I'm afraid somebody's following me." And that could happen to anybody, regardless of their previous existence.
All right, Governor, we're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation, so please stay with us.